Hey everybody, it's Devin Valencia with BCM Pros. Today I want to talk to you about a mind map of sorts that I use when implementing BCM for ServiceNow. Let's get into it. So first I want to talk about what a mind map is. You may not be familiar with the term, but it's basically just a way to organize your thoughts cohesively so that everything kind of fits together. That's the simplest way I can kind of explain it, but there's lots and lots of books on it. I have a couple recommendations if you need some, but it's a very useful kind of way of thinking, especially when it comes to implementing ServiceNow modules. And the reason why is it allows for us to kind of bucket all of our requirements into these very common areas within the application. So I'll explain exactly what I mean. So right now I use 14 kind of nodes or branches, if you want to think of it that way, for our BCM mind map. So I'll start at the top and we'll go through each one a little bit, but we'll have later content kind of going into detail on what considerations you might want to have or talk through as you look at each of these nodes. We sort these nodes by just kind of how conversations go, right? So a lot of times the node that we're looking at first is often the node that gets talked about first without people even knowing about it. So we'll kind of touch on that. So the first one is BCM scope, right? So the scope will tell you basically what are all the types of items that you want to do plans for. Continuity plan, DR plans. What are all the items that you want to include as dependencies? And so that's, generally speaking, that is the scope for the ServiceNow BCM, right? So what are you doing plans for? What are you doing impact analysis for? And then what are the potential types of dependencies that you might have for anything you're doing impact analysis for? The second node is groups and users. This one's fairly common in any module, and there's a lot of out-of-box configuration already set up for this, obviously with anything else. But what I find is organizations' needs are unique, right? There's no one solution that fits all. ServiceNow, that's what makes ServiceNow great. It's just a solution that allows for you to make adjustments while also taking advantage of continuous upgrades, as long as you do it right. So you have to kind of make sure you balance your changes and that you're making the changes correctly. That's a whole other conversation I'm not going into today. But so yeah, groups and users, it's often a subject that gets revisited throughout the UAT of these stories that you're having clients test, or testing yourself if you're a client trying to implement it with yourself, which I wouldn't recommend, but hey, you do you. The third node are approval flows. This one's actually fairly straightforward in most of the implementations we do. In most situations, everyone kind of knows what that approval looks like or that process looks like, and we oftentimes don't have to revisit it after the first couple conversations around it. So that one's self-explanatory. But I should mention, this is approval flows for plans, for BIAs, for exercises, and for activation, right? Otherwise known as crisis. So you can have approvals for all four of those components, the four pillars of BCM, or at least in ServiceNow, I call it. The next two nodes are RPO assessment and RTO assessment. And typically I talk about RTO first because this is obviously everything has an RTO. Not every impact analysis will produce an RPO. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty there, but those should be considered their own areas of conversation, their own areas of focus when it comes to BCM implementations, because there's a lot that goes on there, right? Every organization has their own special way of calculating how they get that RTO, and even the type of questions that they ask for getting there, right? Same with the RPO. Yeah, so just always good to kind of organize those complex type of things into their own bucket. The next two nodes are plan setup and BIA setup. And so really those are represented in ServiceNow BCM as the BIA template and plan template. What I find is lots of organizations have multiple types of impact analysis that they want to do, such as a technical impact analysis and a business impact analysis. And then additionally, they also want to accommodate for the need to have disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans. So when you're talking through the BIA setup and plan setup, those are the kind of records that you're looking at, and you want to make sure that you're considering everything that record needs. So for example, a plan template needs to have documentation sections, needs to have loss scenarios, and you have You can organize your recovery tasks in a certain way if you want, and you can also consider not having some of those tabs in the BCM workspace based on how you set up this plan template. So just all sorts of considerations. Again, the more complex the general requirement is, the more likely it should be its own node or bucket or branch or whatever you want to call it in this mind map. The next node I want to talk about are data imports. This is a very complex, or can be a very complex process, especially if you're coming from a different system. So we have migrated clients over from RPX Planner to ServiceNow, Fusion Framework to ServiceNow, spreadsheets to ServiceNow. Obviously, that's a very common one, but it's more difficult, in my opinion, when it's coming from existing systems. And there's a couple of reasons for that we can go into it in a later video. But essentially, there are expectations that you have as a client coming from another system. You kind of expect ServiceNow to be arranged in the same way. So that's the expectation piece is always a challenge with data importing. But then additionally, right, you have to make sure that you import the data from the other system in a way that actually works with the current ServiceNow BCM module. Fortunately, we've had a lot of success there. We haven't had issue with that, but it does take a lot of thought. If you're a client starting out and you're doing this on your own, or you just have your own platform resources, that's definitely something to consider. The next node are PDF reports. So PDF reports come in many flavors. The specific record that you're looking at in this one are document templates. I think there's 4 out-of-box document templates, if I remember correctly, that come with BCM. And this is a very time-consuming process. It really is, because it's all code. Everything that generates the PDF is all code. So you have to make sure that you're looking at this requirement early on, especially if you have a timeline as a partner agency or as a client who's just trying to implement themselves. Make sure you're looking at this requirement early on, because it can be very time consuming. The next node I want to talk about are email rules. This one's simple from as conceptually speaking. When do you want notifications to be sent off as it relates to plans, as it relates to impact analysis, plan activation, and exercising? So just think about all the kind of situations or scenarios where you want emails to be sent out. And one thing I always like to call out is don't try to stuff everything in an email, right? The beauty of the platform is that you want people going into it and using it, not relying on emails. But don't be afraid to put some details in there, but it's a balance. It's more of an art than a science sometimes. The next 2 nodes I want to talk about are plan exercise and plan activation. So like I mentioned, there's 4 pillars to ServiceNow BCM. These are the other 2 pillars. So there's lots of little pieces when it comes to these areas of the application that you want to consider. There might be interface considerations, it might be workflow considerations, something related to automation, security related considerations, right? Maybe you don't want certain users to be able to access or activate a plan for exercising or activate the plan in the event of a crisis. We've seen all sorts of different types of configurations. Definitely something to look at. Separate these 2 areas into areas of focus that you want to consider early on if you can. The last 2 nodes I want to talk about are user reports and user experience. So I'll talk about user reports first, because I feel like that's the most self-explanatory, but it's different than the PDF reports, where the PDF reports kind of talk about or focus on what are the PDF outputs of plans, what are the PDF outputs of impact analysis. The user reports are more like ongoing real-time metrics that you want to capture as a BCM manager or a BCM user, right? A very common example of this is we want to know how many of our tier 1 applications currently have a plan. So that's the kind of report that you'd see in the user reports. And then they're very closely related, because with user experience, a lot of times you're getting the request to show this report on the workspace homepage, right? So there's a lot to consider with user experience, obviously, right? Because there's different groups, different users, different experiences. So that's just an area you want to make sure that you're examining, usually ongoing, right? You're never just stopping at this node, having the conversation, and then calling it a day, right? It's usually ongoing as you go through the implementation. Things become much more obvious to who the stakeholders who are involved, right? Where it might have not been so obvious in the beginning with not as much set up. So just something you want to keep revisiting as you go through your process of implementing ServiceNow BCM. That's the mind map. It's not too complicated, right? There are a lot of little nuances when it comes to the actual implementation, but that's how I like to organize things for my team when we do BCM implementations. It just makes things easier to track. It makes conversations more purposeful, if you will. It just makes it much better experience for everyone involved. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about the exact way I organize this, please let me know in the comments, or if you disagree with how I organize it, also into that, so let me know. But thanks for watching and stay resilient.